Hey, what is going on, everybody? Welcome into this week's edition of my top starts and sits for the week 10 of the NFL season. As always, you're going to get your top two starts and sits for the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end position. I'm going to go ahead and just dive right into this video, starting with the quarterback spot. My top start of the week, I'm going to go up there in the northwest part of the country and go with Geno Smith against the Commanders. The Commanders are allowing 20.2 points per game to quarterbacks this season. That is tied for the second most allowed. And then when we look at what the Commanders have led up over the last three games, they have let three different quarterbacks go over 275 passing yards, and they've given up 9 touchdowns. They have picked off the quarterback 4 times. But yeah, they've been giving up a lot of yards over the past few weeks. They don't have Chase Young. They don't have Montez Sweat. So I definitely expect that Geno Smith is going to have time to sit in the pocket and let DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Jackson Smith-Njigba to tear it up on their routes, so then he can have a huge game. So Geno has been a streaming quarterback, this season. You play him when the matchup's right. You don't play him when the matchup is wrong, and this is a right matchup for Geno. So if you're looking for a streaming option, I would highly consider putting him in your lineup. Another guy you can go on is I'm gonna go with Will Levis, the rookie quarterback for the Titans against the Bucks, who has been named the starter going forward for Tennessee. We just saw what the rookie C.J. Stroud did this past weekend against that Tampa Bay secondary. Now I don't think Levis is. Oh, maybe I could be wrong, but I don't think Levis is gonna reach that type of production. But the Bucks have been giving up tons of points this year to quarterbacks. They are actually tied with the Commanders. They are also giving up the second most points per game at the 22.2 points per game mark. And then when we look at the last 4 games for the Buccaneers defense, they have allowed 3 different quarterbacks to throw over 300 yards. And then the other game, it was Desmond Ridder, and he threw over 250 yards. And then when we look at what they've allowed, they've also allowed 9 touchdowns to passing touchdowns to quarterbacks, and they only have 1 interception. So, again, we just saw with C.J. Stroud. Teams are just throwing the ball all over this Tampa Bay defense because you can't run against this defense, which is kind of a spoiler alert for a section coming up here shortly. So yeah, those are my top 2 starts. My top sit of the week, I'm going to go with Deshaun Watson against the Baltimore Ravens. Ravens arguably have the best defense in the NFL with how they are playing right now. When we look at as far as fantasy, quarterbacks are only scoring 10.3 points per game against their defense. That's the fewest in the NFL. When we look at the last 4 games, only 1 quarterback threw over 210 yards against that Baltimore defense, and they've only given up 2 passing touchdowns, and they have picked off the quarterback 5 times over the last 4 games. So I know Deshaun Watson's back in the lineup. He had some flashes last week, but I would rather stream a Levis or a Smith over Deshaun Watson in week 10. My other sit, and I know he's coming off a strong fantasy game against that Eagles defense, but I am going to go with Dak Prescott against the Giants. And you might be thinking I'm crazy, the Giants are a terrible team. Well, I have my reasonings. First of all, as far as fantasy this season, quarterbacks are only scoring 13.8 points per game against that Giants defense. That's the 6th fewest in the NFL. And then last year against the Giants, in 2 games, Dak Prescott only threw for 404 yards, so that's 202 yards a game, and he only had 2 touchdowns, passing touchdowns in the 2 matchups against New York last year. And then when we look at what the New York Giants have done over the last 4 games, their defense have only let 2 different quarterbacks throw over 210 yards, and there's only been 3 passing touchdowns allowed in the last 4 games, and they have 2 interceptions. So, and another thing I want to factor in too is this Giants team is obviously it's terrible. I think that's what Tommy DeVito is going to be their starting quarterback. So can't you see the Cowboys beating up on the Giants early, going up like 21-0 at halftime? And so what is that going to mean? They're going to come out in the second half and they're just going to run the ball until they decide to put Dak Prescott on the sideline. So if you are playing Dak Prescott, you better hope the Giants make this a competitive game, because if he doesn't get his production before the blowout potentially happens, and then you're going to be left wondering, wishing that you had more out of Prescott. So even though he's coming off that strong game, going against a bad team, I think there's reasons why you should consider different options over Dak this week. Moving into my top starts and sits at the running back position. My top start, he is playing tomorrow night, so if you do have him on your roster, you want to make sure he is in that lineup before that game kicks off. I'm going to go with D'Onta Foreman against the Panthers. Before I dive into the stats, this is a revenge game. D'Onta Foreman played for the Panthers last season, so you know the fact that they didn't re-sign him. They went out and signed Miles Sanders, right? You know he's going to want to go off against his former team. And then when we look at the stats-wise for fantasy this year, the Panthers are giving up 25.8 points per game to running backs this year. That's the second most allowed. Over the last 4 games, 2 different running backs have ran over 100 yards against their defense, and they have allowed 7 running back touchdowns over the last 4 games. So giving up the yards, giving up the touchdowns, and then you factor in that revenge game for D'Onta Foreman. This is definitely a week where you would want to. He would be a really good flex play, and especially probably more. I'll be interested to see what his pricing is on the daily lineups, but he's definitely going to be in my daily lineups tomorrow night. My top starts. My second top start, I'm going to go with Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier against the Cardinals. Now, I'm right there with everybody in the football verse, the fantasy football verse, where they're upset with Arthur Smith's usage over Bijan Robinson. But I think this is going to be the game where the media has been hammering him, fans have been hammering him, the football world's been hammering him about the lack of use of Bijan. I feel like he's going to be like, all right, I'm just going to force feed him so people can shut up. And I mean, he's got to, because the Cardinals' rushing defense has been bad this year. As far as fantasy, they're giving up 22 points per game. That's the third most allowed in the NFL. And then over the last 4 games, they've allowed 2 different running backs to run over 100 rushing yards, and then they've allowed 5 running back touchdowns. I really deep down inside feel like this is going to be the Bijan game we've all been waiting for. I feel like he's going to go over 150 total yards and have 2 touchdowns on Sunday. And as far as Tyler Algier, that might be more of a sneaky, cheap daily lineup play where you can slide him in there, because you know Arthur Smith, he's not going to just put Algier on the sidelines. Algier is going to get his fair share of work as well. Moving into my top sit of the week. I know this could be controversial, but I'm going to go with Derrick Henry against the Bucks. Now, seasonal leagues, you're probably going to play Derrick Henry. Totally get it, but this is what I always say, just temper your expectations with Derrick Henry's potential outcome from this game. But then when you put your daily lineups together this weekend, Henry's a guy I would look not to have in those lineups. Now, when we look at this Bucks matchup, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are only giving up 11.3 points per game to running backs this year. That is the second fewest. Over the last 4 games, the most rushing yards that a running back has gained against them is just 67 yards, and they haven't allowed a running back touchdown in their last 5 or 6. I know for sure 5 games. I should have went back to the 6, but I've been I like to stick it back into 4 games. But Dameon Pierce was the sit last week for the Texans, and they didn't allow a touchdown in the previous 4 games before that game, and then they still have yet to allow a touchdown in at least the last 5 games. So again, seasonal leagues, you're probably going to play him, but expect that Henry's probably going to have a game that's closer to his floor than to his ceiling. My other sit, I am going to go with Gus Edwards against the Browns. You include Justice Hill in this as well. You can include the rookie Keaton Mitchell in this as well. As far as what the Browns are doing against running backs this year, they're only giving up 12.4 points per game. That is the 5th fewest across the league. And then as far as what they're allowing, they've allowed, the most yards they've allowed is just 75 yards to a single running back over the last 4 games. And then as far as touchdown production, they have given up 3 running back touchdowns, but that's still less than an average of a touchdown a game. So they're one of the better defenses in the league. I feel like this is going to have to be the Lamar Jackson show that's going to win this game for the Baltimore team. Sorry about that, guys. I gotta plug my computer in, about to die on me. But yeah, anyways, getting back on track here. Yeah, I just think that it's going to be more on Lamar Jackson in this game, and it's just that the Cleveland defense is really great. So if you have a better option, I would definitely play D'Onta Foreman, over a Gus Edwards this week. Moving into my top starts and sits for my wide receivers, for the wide receivers, my top start of the week, I am going to go with DeAndre Hopkins against the Bucks. Now, there's a theme here, right? The Bucks are really good against the run, but they are completely struggling against the pass. As far as fantasy, they're giving up the second most points per game to wide receivers this year. That's giving up 28.6 points per game. And then over the last 4 games, they've allowed 3 different wide receivers to go over 100 receiving yards, and they've allowed 7 wide receiver touchdowns over the last 4 games. Giving up the yards, giving up the touchdowns, so I definitely like a ceiling performance out of Hopkins in Week 10. My other top start, can't believe I'm telling people to play against the Niners, but the Niners defense has really lacked over the last couple weeks heading into their bye, where they let like a Joe Burrow and a Kirk Cousins light them up. But I think that might be able to happen again on Sunday. Calvin Ridley and Christian Kirk against the 49ers. As far as the whole season, the 49ers are actually giving up 24.2 points per game to wide receivers this year. That is the 6th most in the NFL. And their last 4 games, they've allowed 3 different wide receivers to go over 100 receiving yards, and they have allowed 6 wide receiver touchdowns over the last 4 games. So their defense is not as vaunted as it looked earlier in the season. I know they made some additions at the trade deadline, but they didn't help out that secondary, and that secondary has been struggling there in San Fran over the past 4 weeks. So that's something to factor in. And then obviously the Jaguars are coming off a bye. They'll be a confident group playing at home. So I definitely expect Ridley and Kirk to perform pretty well in this week. My top sits. Now, this might be another controversial name, but when you look at what he's actually done in this matchup, it actually says that you probably might want to consider sitting him like in seasonal leagues. But I am going to go with Davante Adams and Jacoby Myers against the Jets. Now, Davante Adams, I get it. You're probably going to play him. Just like I talked about with Derrick Henry, just temper your expectations. Adams is probably going to have a floor game, and unfortunately, because of his quarterback situation this season, his floor games is significantly low than in previous years. He just doesn't catch the ball enough, even though he might get the targets. He just does not play. We'll have to see what what Aiden O'Connell can be, but until proven, I don't think you can trust Adams until O'Connell proves himself. But when we look at this matchup, against the Jets. That Jets defense is really good, especially against wide receivers with like Sauce Gardner. They're only giving up 12.1 points per game to wide receivers this year. That is the fewest in the NFL, and that's by 3.8 points to the second team, which I'm going to talk about here shortly. When we look at the last 4 games, they've only allowed one 100-yard receiver, and that was A.J. Brown. But A.J. Brown plays with Jalen Hurts. Davante is not playing with Jalen Hurts. The next most gained by a wide receiver was Keenan Allen, who only got to 77 yards, and he plays with Justin Herbert. And Keenan Allen's, you can argue between Davante and Keenan Allen, they're probably I would honestly, in my opinion, top 2 route runners in the NFL. So they're similar. I don't want to go say similar players, but similar players as far as their route running ability. And the Jets defense was able to keep Allen underneath 100 yards. So that's something to even factor in. And over the last 4 games, a wide receiver has not scored a touchdown against the Jets defense. So they are really good on defense. They're keeping wide receivers at bay, and they're keeping them out of the end zone. So again, you play Adams, I get it. Just temper your expectations. But I definitely would not play Myers, and I definitely am not going to have Adams in my daily lineups this weekend. My other top sit, I am going to go with Amari Cooper against the Ravens. I talked about how great this Ravens defense is with Deshaun Watson, so I don't want to rehash that all. But when we take a look at the wide receiver stats, they're only giving up 15.9 points per game to wide receivers this year. That is the second fewest in the NFL. Over the last 4 games, only one wide receiver finished over 100 yards against them, and that is Amon-Ra St. Brown. I think Amon-Ra St. Brown finishes over 100 yards in every game because he catches like 11 balls. And then as far as the next wide receiver was only able to get to 63 yards against that defense. They've only given up 1 wide receiver touchdown in the last 4 games. So if you are going to play Cooper, I feel like he's going to be a touchdown dependent play, where if he doesn't get you a touchdown, he's going to have a very disappointing outcome for you in Week 10. Moving into my next section and the final one, my top starts and sits at tight end. My top start of the week, I am going to go with Dalton Schultz against the Bengals. He's really developed some chemistry over the last few weeks with CJ Stroud, and I see that carrying over into this matchup. The Bengals defense are giving up 9.4 points per game to tight ends this year. That's tied for the second most allowed. Over the last 2 games, tight ends have gone over 80 receiving yards against them, and then they've only given up 1 tight end touchdown. So this is more of the yards production, and then also the season as a whole, as far as fantasy, giving up those 9.4 points per game, and then also what Dalton Schultz and CJ Stroud has done over their past 2 games. My other top start, I am going to go with Sam Laporta against the Chargers. The Chargers are giving up 7.9 points per game this year. That's the 8th most, but more because of these yards they've been giving up to tight ends. Over the last 4 games, the Chargers have allowed 3 different tight ends to go over 65 receiving yards. And then they will also have only given up 1 tight end touchdown. But just like I said about the Bengals, this Chargers defense is allowing tight ends to get the yards against them. And I like the chances of Laporta getting into that end zone because he is that red zone threat for Jared Goff and that Detroit Lions offense. Moving into my sits, and I am going to go with Evan Engram against the 49ers, which you're probably like, what? You said start the wide receivers, but what it is Fred Warner is one of the better coverage linebackers in the NFL, so it's really hard to throw in that middle of the defense against San Francisco. So when we look at this matchup, the 49ers are only giving up 4.1 points per game to tight ends. That's tied for the second fewest in the league. The most yards over the last 4 games that they allowed was 86 receiving yards. That was to TJ Hawkinson, but the next best game by a tight end was 28 yards. So as you can tell, there's a potential of a high ceiling because Evan Engram can get to that type of production that Hawkinson got to him, but there's also that really low floor where he could finish like 3 catches for 30 yards and no touchdowns. And then speaking of that, the 49ers have not allowed a tight end to score a touchdown against them over their last 4 games. So everything is kind of funneled outside of that 49ers secondary, and then everything in the middle is kind of congested. So I just do not like this matchup for Engram in Week 10. My other sit, even though he's coming off a strong game as well, I'm going to go with Jake Ferguson against the Giants. The Giants are only giving up 4.8 points per game to tight ends this year. That is the 3rd fewest across the league. The most yards that a single tight end has finished with in the last 4 games against the Giants has been 51 yards, and the next best tight end finish was 19 yards. So they have not allowed a tight end to go over 55 yards over the last 4 games. They've only given up 1 tight end touchdown. And then, like I talked about Dak, right? I just see this Cowboys team beating up on the Giants where they're not going to be throwing the ball a lot in the second half. So unless Ferguson gets that production for you in the first half, there's a good chance that he's just going to be blocking in the second half until they maybe pull the starters and he's on the sidelines in the 4th quarter. So yeah, that is my top starts and sits for Week 10 of this NFL season. As always, guys, though, if there's any players I did not speak about in this video, you can always get in a comment, you can get into a DM, and I always try to get back to you as soon as I can. And as always, hit the like button, hit subscribe, hit follow, whatever you're watching this on. You guys will definitely get me next Tuesday for my top waiver wire targets and streamable defenses. You will get that on time this week. I do appreciate the patience out of everybody with last night's video coming a little bit later because of my work dinner I had after work yesterday. So anyways, you guys don't need to hear about my personal life. I'm gonna hop off here. I hope you guys win your matchups and make this strong push for the playoffs. I'll talk to you guys next week. Peace out.